I'm Shanaz Mohammed, and I'm a Pretoria-based artist who works predominantly in hand paper cut. I'm currently doing my master's at the University of Pretoria and part-time curating at Freed Contemporary.
Thank you very much for that, Shanaz. Tell us a bit about your work.
My work deals with a religious content in terms of remystifying Islamic aesthetics. So I look at my position of being a female Muslim in South Africa and how I deal with the religion in that context. So it's very different, obviously, to other countries and other people, and I feel we sort of have our own interpretation of it. So I question what I deal with on a daily basis and what it means to me, and so it's sort of just questioning and understanding what I do, why I do it, and then also just finding out for myself, sort of figuring out the method to the madness of it. And I think that's what my work deals with, and also the sort of restraints and boundaries that are placed on Muslim artists specifically. But being in my context, it's obviously not as severe. So it's just dealing with finding that balance and how do I deal with my restraints and the boundaries that I have within a South African context.
Okay. Now, you talk about remystifying.
Yes.
Now, from a global perspective, I think Islam is already quite mystified and misunderstood, very misunderstood. What do you mean by remystify?
With that, I look at more of how I interpret the religion itself, or how I see it. Because for me, working within that context, I see it more as a lifestyle than a religion. So it heavily informs everything that I do, whether it's in art or just socially, or it's in that type of context. So by remystifying it, I think I'm bringing my own sort of or reimagining my own interpretations of the religion into my artwork. So making it sort of, I don't know, how would you say, my own little secrets or my own little things into these works or into what I do. So in that sense, I'm remystifying what it means to me or what it means to viewers, but in my own interpretation of it.
Okay, now, you work predominantly in photography. Would that be correct?
I would say paper cut, but I started off with a photography basis. Well, it was in my fourth year of studies that I went into that new medium. Yeah.
Okay, and then from there, satellite paper engineering was introduced.
Yes,
Okay.
but I would consider it more performative photography, because a lot of the images that I use were taken from video stills that I've done, and those entailed doing sort of performances of daily rituals or daily things that I would do as a female Muslim. So I would choose stills from there and use that as photography.
Okay. Talk to me a bit more about the performative version of the photography.
I would select things that I would question and what I wanted to know more about, because it's also a journey for me of exploring these ideas and these concepts, because when we're brought up, we're sort of just told that this is what you have to do and you have to do it. And as I got older, I thought, well, I need to question why I'm doing it. I need to understand, because a lot of fear comes from not understanding something, which I think is sort of that stigma around Islam and is not understanding. And that's what I wanted to do, is to understand it for myself. So in that sense, I took certain aspects. For example, I like the hijab or the headscarf. And I would question, okay, well, what is the significance for this? Or I was told, yes, I have to wait, or for certain occasions or certain things. And then, but my mom, like, she wears it full time. And for her, it was sort of her spiritual journey, and her interpretation of it was that why she chose to wear it. So for me, it was just questioning what is the significance of this, or what does it do for you spiritually or on another level? So I would take that, and in my performative process was just layer it onto myself. So that was the one aspect that I did, was just layering the hijab on, because there's such like heavy stereotypes that come with this veiled figure in black, and so when I choose to do this performative videos, then I sort of take the hijab that I have or things that are around me, which is not necessarily black. It's colourful, it's sort of fashionable and trendy, and so it's sort of, you know, that again, that my interpretation of being in this context. So I would take that and sort of layer it on, and you know, just see what happens with that process and of my revealing and concealing and that sort of understanding.
Okay, you spoke about that work particularly in the catalogue that from your fourth year. I think it's from your fourth year.
Yes.
Now, one of the interesting descriptive words you used was erotic. Talk to us more about that, because I think the interesting thing there is that it is a very limiting. The process of wearing a headscarf or the burqa is about protecting the woman's body.
Yes, and modesty, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and stopping men from being seduced, in essence, from my understanding. And it's quite interesting that you talk about the idea of the erotic in that. Could you please just elaborate a bit more on that?
That comes from a sense of being the exotic as well. I think that was a term that was thrown around in my fourth year as well, with a lot of people that were viewing my work for the first time would think, oh, it's exotic work, and the images that I use, because I use myself in the works as well, and they were sort of like very posed or staged in a sense that to make it look more appealing, or to sort of maybe mystify this idea of the hijab. So I wanted to bring in that sort of sense of it sort of breaks that wall of not being able to understand what you're looking at. So I thought the idea of making it more beautiful or more seductive would be a way to get people to sort of view it easier, or so they don't feel that they need to, or they don't feel blocked off from the work by not understanding what it's about, or the religion, or anything like that. So for me, it was just, my intention was to get, the audience to sort of make it more accessible for a wider audience, I think, was bringing in that idea of seduction or erotic.
Okay.
Yeah.
What comes through in what you just said is the idea of the Western secular world and its views on a very strong, I don't want to call it religious, but almost an insular spiritual system that's very based on tradition and process. How do you marry those two opposites? Because obviously you are Africa.
So yeah, for me, I feel like I am in both those worlds, and that was actually what my fourth year dissertation was, or fourth year research paper was based on, was being two worlds in one body, because I'm so heavily influenced by the West, and then I still have this religious background that's also quite influential in my life. So I think it was much easier for me to marry the two, because that's my understanding of everything, and that's sort of the lifestyle that we made up here in South Africa. It was just having your Western influence and the religious influence as well. So I think it was much easier for me to sort of, I would say, integrate those two boundaries. And it was never something that I thought of, or something that was a problem for me.
Yeah. Now, obviously, when you're at home, when you're in your community, you are a full Muslim girl in contemporary society. How does the community react to you being an artist? Because in Islam there are certain restrictions in the idea of representation.
Yeah, it's quite a mixed reaction. Like I said, like people fear what they don't understand.
Yeah.
So it's always it's very interesting when I tell people that I'm an artist, because they just think I paint or I draw, or it's always, but they never ask me more about it. that's what I find interesting. They don't want to know more, I think, because they're scared or they don't know what they might find out if they inquire about it. So it is interesting to it, but I think the idea is very narrow when it comes to art because they have a certain idea of what it is supposed to be. And I think that's where my Islamic aesthetics come into my work with the patterning, is to sort of make it accessible to them, because if they see something relatable and something familiar, they might inquire more about it or want to know, well, you know, why is it stripped of its color, or you know, what I know this pattern, or I know this image, and that's what's interesting. But I always find it so funny with trying to do figures and abstraction, or that sort of merge in my work, because as long as I use the figure in my work, I can never hang it up in my own house. I can't hang it up in my parents' house. It's something that, you know, just won't be allowed.
Yeah.
But I do it anyway, and I think that's why I use myself in my work and not any other figure, because I feel more comfortable, and I think then, you know, the onus would be on me, and so it's not implicating anyone else in the work.
So in essence, it could also be seen as you trying to find your physicality in your practice as well as your faith.
Yeah, I think that could be true as well for my work. And also, just to go back on your other point, it's a lot of, sometimes people may see it as controversial in how I use the figure. So, for instance, I had a work out 2 years ago at the Turban Art Fair as well, but it was myself in the full niqab. But because I'm not dressed like that on a daily basis, and I chose to photograph myself in that way, some people, I had a Muslim man that came to me and he found it quite offensive that I put that up, and I sort of had these like colored circles with paint that I did over the figure as well. But it was, for me, it was a sort of celebration of the South African culture and me being in the society. But he took it like a totally different way, and it was quite interesting, and he told me, he joked about it after, but he was like, you know, you could be like stoned for this, like, what are you doing? So it's interesting the reactions that I get. I think now with the younger generation, they're like, no, it's cool because, I mean, everyone takes selfies and we all take photos, so it's not that much of an issue. But he was an older guy, and I think the older generation doesn't quite understand what I'm doing, especially because they're not familiar with art, or weren't exposed to it as much. I think it's even more difficult for them to deal with the subject matter of my art than just the art itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk to us a bit about Islam aesthetic, because I find that quite interesting.
That's more to deal with the abstraction that comes from Islam, because there was a rejection to figurative representation. Abstraction was the more lean towards form of art, and it actually came from craftsmen or artisans that started off doing decorative illustrations in mosques or certain architecture, because, you know, that they try to beautify the place. So that's where that sort of aesthetic came from, and it's not so much from geometrics. I know a lot of the history deals with the geometry behind these patterns or behind these sort of aesthetics, but it actually came from just doing what they know how to do or what they feel they could do, which then later on obviously evolved into more complicated, intricate patterns, and then bringing geometry in it. But it started off very simple. There were figurations in early Islamic art, but that was sort of to illustrate something that was said in the Quran maybe, or to try and, you know, understand something else. So those aesthetics come from, well, for my reference in my art, it comes from mainly Islamic architecture, and because that's what we were exposed to growing up, that's the sort of only art we knew. So I sort of went back to that familiarity and that, you know, that sort of aesthetic in Islamic art.
Okay, so there has been a history of a very strong aesthetic sense, although geometric. Then obviously there is an issue with the Islamic State. effacing all the images and decorative aspects. Where do you think that might come from? Just as a left field question.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure, because it's so weird how a lot of what they do contradicts with a lot of what we are taught and what we think. So it's quite strange that they would choose to do that. I know a lot of Muslim artists or international Muslim artists who get their works defaced and you know, sort of a rejection to their work. But I'm not sure with the Islamic State, or what, you know, is their reasoning for the traditional, to deface the traditional, I think. Yeah, it's quite strange.